Hello, friends. This is Pam from Preserving Life Ministries, and we're back discussing minestrone soup. So, in the Bible, minestrone soup is called pottage. In Genesis chapter 25, Jacob and Esau are discussing a serving of pottage because Esau is very hungry. So, what is the history of pottage? Where did it come from? Well, it was a staple in the medieval English peasants' lives. They were workers in the king's vineyard and his gardens. And so they were able to glean what was left in the gardens and make that into their meals. So they were basically vegetarians. They ate very little meat because they were very poor and they couldn't afford it. They had a high carbohydrate, low fat diet of vegetables, herbs, and grains, and they were very healthy and strong. On the other hand, the wealthy, the kings, the lords, the princes of those days, they were very sedentary and ate a high-fat diet with lots of proteins, lots of calories. They ate baked goods and meats and considered that vegetables were a poor man's food, so they would not allow that to grace their tables. So therefore, they tended to be obese. So who do you believe was healthier and lived longer? 16th century drawings of the kings and queens, if you take a look at those, you'll notice that they were pretty large people. And King Henry VIII there's a lot of drawings available of him. But it was said about him that he was so large that his servants had to use a hoist to lift him up to the saddle of his horse. He suffered from gout, he had leg ulcers, he had diabetes, and he weighed about 400 pounds when he died at the ripe old age of 55. What are the origins of the minestrone soup itself? Well, it was a thick Italian soup made with vegetables, pasta, rice, and beans, a little stock, and some seasonings. These were usually the things that the Italian peasants had in their gardens. There is no real recipe for it. It's a regional dish. So different parts of Italy use different ingredients to make the soup. But its earliest origins were the Latin tribes of the Roman kingdoms. They called it pulci, or porridge, and they made it using spelt flour as a thickener. They added salt, water, and local vegetables, and that was their pottage. In the mid-16th century, tomatoes and potatoes were brought in from the Americas, and they became a food staple, but they changed the way that pottage was made, or minestrone soup. So at that time, spelt flour was removed and bread was introduced. So if you know anything about Italian culture, bread is a staple at every meal. But with minestrone soup, bread croutons are toasted and put on top of the soup, or crusty bread is served with the soup in the meal. The key to making minestrone soup is early preparation. Because of the soup's many ingredients, there are 25 to 30 ingredients in any recipe for minestrone soup. But don't let that intimidate you into not making the soup, because it's well worth the time, it's very delicious, and it doesn't take a lot of effort, just a little early preparation. The key to success is setting up your kitchen the night before you're going to can. So in order to do this, you want to wash your jars, your lids, and your rings. You want to take out your canning pots and your stew pot that you're going to make the soup in and get those all cleaned and ready. You want to gather all of the necessary canning tools. You'll need a jar lifter and a funnel. You'll need a headspace measurer and a magnet to take your lids out of the hot water. You want to make your broth the night before. I'm a vegan or plant-based, so I would make my vegetable broth the night before, allow it to cool, jar it, and just put it in the refrigerator ready for use in the morning. You want to measure all your dry seasonings. There are a lot of herbs and spices in this soup, so you can measure those out the night before, put them in little dishes, put a little cover or plastic wrap over them, and set them to the side, and they'll be ready to go. And then the last thing you want to do is wash and chop your vegetables and put those into dishes or into Ziploc bags and refrigerate them. Now you're ready to make the soup. The ingredients for the soup will be listed below, and they're listed on the screen for you to see. So I will include the entire instructions for making the soup in the description. But let's just go over the ingredients so you have an idea of how simple but delicious these ingredients are. You need a cup of dry Great Northern or cannellini beans, and you want to soak those overnight and then cook them until they're tender. Or you can use canned beans. If you've already canned your beans, take out a can of those. That would be great. Or purchase a 15-ounce can of cannellini beans. You need a cup of leeks. You're going to chop those, a medium yellow onion, some potatoes, zucchini, some spinach, a few cloves of garlic. As I said, the broth that you made the night before, some olive oil. Olive oil always adds texture, smoothness, and taste to any soup. You want to add some crushed rosemary. Now, for those of you who have herb gardens, this is where you can use those fresh herbs, and plenty of them. You can pull out your rosemary, your oregano, and your bay leaves and add those to this soup. Some fresh thyme and marjoram. Wouldn't that be delicious? Also, you'll need some salt, some lemon juice, carrots, celery, yellow squash, green bean bites, just cut into little bite-sized pieces, cabbage or kale chopped. I use both. And then some diced roasted tomatoes. Now, just take your garden tomatoes and put a little olive oil on them, put them on a cookie sheet, put them in a 500-degree oven, and let them char. And once they've done that, take them out, put them in a paper bag so that that skin softens, peel the skin off, and you can use your own fresh roasted tomatoes in the soup. That's something you can do the night before as well. You need a couple of cups of water, some tomato paste or tomato powder. If you dehydrate your tomatoes and grind them into a powder, that's a wonderful substitute for tomato paste. Then you need a little garlic powder, some cayenne pepper, some red pepper flakes, but if you don't like hot, don't put in the pepper flakes. Those two items are optional. And then for a topping of the soup, because you can't can it without having a bowl for dinner, you need to make your favorite vegan Parmesan cheese as a topping. The last ingredient is pasta shells, and you want a small shell. If you're canning the soup, you omit the shells until you're ready to serve the soup. Then you cook the shells and add them to your hot soup and serve it. And the reason for not canning the pasta in the soup is that the pasta is very starchy. It will break down and cause the soup to have a texture that's not very pleasant. And sometimes it will also cause the soup to spoil. So therefore, we're going to can the soup, so we're going to leave the pasta out. The directions for making the soup: you're going to heat the olive oil in a Dutch oven or a stock pot, and you're going to add your onions, your leeks, your carrots, your celery, and the tomato paste. Then add a teaspoon of salt and cook them until they're nice and tender. It takes about 5 to 8 minutes for them to get to the consistency that you would want. Then you're going to add your potatoes, your yellow squash, your zucchini, some garlic, some rosemary and thyme, and the rest of your herbs. And you're going to cook that for another 2 or 3 more minutes, stirring it quite often because you don't want it to stick, but you want those herbs to be fully incorporated into the soup. Next, you're going to add your diced tomatoes and your beans, your tender vegetables like the spinach and the kale and the cabbage and the green beans. And then with that, you're going to pour in your broth and water. And then if you've chosen to use the cayenne and red pepper flakes, you add them next. Stir it well, raise the heat to medium-high, and bring the soup to a light boil. Once it boils, partially cover the lid, allowing the steam to escape and reduce the heat to simmer. And you want to let that gently simmer for 15 to 20 minutes. Then remove the lid, check to see that the vegetables are tender, and then remove from the heat. Now, the next step is to take out the bay leaf and toss it, because you really don't want to have to can that because it's not really edible. So you're going to stir in your lemon juice at this point and taste for seasoning. And if it's exactly the way you want it, you're ready to jar. So to pressure can the soup, you want to take your hot jars from your hot canner and you want to fill the jar with the soup to 1-inch headspace. Then you're going to remove the air bubbles and wipe the rim of the jar. The next step is to apply the lid and then the ring and tighten it fingertip tight only. And remember, that's to let the air escape so that you can create that seal and that food will be preserved for a very long time. You're going to place all of your filled jars into your pressure canner, and you're going to, which has been filled with water according to your manufacturer's directions. For my canner, it's 3 inches of water in the pressure canner. So once you've gotten your capacity of jars in that canner, You're going to place the lid on and lock it, and you're going to process your jars for 90 minutes if you're using quart size, and 75 minutes if you're using pints. And you're going to use 10 pounds of pressure for my altitude, but please check your altitude, because if you are above 1,000 feet sea level, you will need to change either the timing or the amount of pressure that you're putting on your canner in order to can this safely. So once your canner has processed for the 90 minutes, if you use quart-sized jars, you're going to allow it to cool. You're going to turn off the flame and allow that gauge to go to 0. Never try to open your canner by pouring water, cold water over the lid or removing it from the burner. It's a very unsafe practice, and it could cause damage to the jars inside of the canner as well as to the lid of the canner itself. So you want to allow it to cool on its own. Depending on your canner, it could take anywhere from 20 minutes to 40 minutes to cool. But once it gets to 0, it's safe to take off the weight and unlock the lid and remove the jars. You want to set the jars in a cool, draft-free place for 12 to 24 hours and allow them to rest and the seal to take effect. And then once that has happened, the last step you want to take is to remove the ring from the jar and wash the outside of the jar with warm soapy water and rinse it well. Wash the inside of the ring as well, because during the canning process, when the steam is escaping from the jar, liquid or juices also escape from the jar, and they leave a residue on the outside. When you don't wash them, that residue will mold, and the mold will begin to grow along the ring and around the rim of the jar, and soon you will see it creeping to the outside of the jar, and you don't want that to happen. It's not that the mold will grow inside the jar. It can't, because the jar is sealed, but it doesn't look very pleasant, and nor is it very healthy to have that mold growing on the outside of the jar. So don't skip that step. Once you wash the jars, you have a choice of whether or not you want to put the ring back on. If you choose to put it back on, which I do, because it actually helps to keep that lid flat. And if the jars get bumped or knocked off the shelf, it can actually be like a safety measure, because sometimes the jar will just hit the metal and the metal will dent and it'll prevent the jar from breaking. So I put my rings back on, but it's your choice. It's very safe to leave the ring off and still put your jars away for storage. Before you put them away for storage though, you want to label them with the product and the date. You can either label the lid of the jar, put a label on the jar itself, or label the box or the shelf. It's your choice. Once you've done that, you have completed your canning process. You have a beautiful jar, or several beautiful jars, of minestrone soup to eat whenever you like. I love canning soups and beans and stews, because when guests come over and I'm unprepared, I'm always prepared. So in an emergency, having something like this on hand is really a blessing. So I hope you've learned a lot about canning minestrone soup. Now follow me into the kitchen, and we're going to actually put what we've just talked about into practice. And you can come along with me. You have the list of ingredients now. You have the list of supplies that you will need. And make this soup with me. And write in the comments below how you found the process to be, whether you found it laborious or whether you enjoyed it. Let me know what the soup was like and how it tasted. So I'm looking forward to hearing from each and every one of you. If you enjoyed this video, give us a like, subscribe, hit the notification button. We'll see you next time in the Preserving Life Kitchen.